I'd like to talk to you a little bit about economic policy and what the Labour government might do to solve a huge, huge problem. And the problem is that for the last 10 years, most people in this country have had no increase in their living standards at all. And the really daunting fact is that if we're not very careful, we're going to go into another 10 years with the same problem. And I think the consequences of another 10 years of stagnant incomes for vast numbers of the population, while a privileged minority are steaming ahead and getting wealthier and wealthier, is really daunting, not only economically, but socially and politically as well, and something which we really, really need to avoid. So what I want to talk to you about is what might be done to try and stop this happening. And I think there are two really major problems that the British economy's got, which we have to do something about. The first is that the levels of investment in the future that we make in this country is pitifully low compared to what it is in most other countries. The average proportion of our national income that we invest every year is about 16 or 17%. The world average is about 26%, and in China it's something like 45%. But worse than that, not only are we investing very small amounts of our national income in the future, but we're investing very largely in the wrong things. Let me tell you this little story about history. In 250 years ago, about 80% of the population worked in agriculture. Now it's about 2%. And the reason for that is that we've got tractors and combine harvesters and different seeds and all this kind of thing, an enormous change in the technology of agriculture. But if you look at how long it takes to cut your hair or to serve a meal, it's the same length of time now as it was 250 years ago. And our problem is that we're depending far too much on these sort of service occupations where getting productivity up is incredibly difficult. And what we're not doing is looking at the opportunities there are in the areas where increases in productivity are much more easy to achieve. And these are basically quite a small area. It's mechanisation and technology and power and very little else. And this is a bit of a snare and delusion because there is quite a lot of pressure nowadays, and understandably so, to spend more money on public sector investment to increase the living standards. And what I would say to you is this, that although getting better housing and road and rail and schools and hospitals is terribly important from a social point of view, unfortunately it doesn't produce much in the way of economic growth, nor is that the case for a large amount of private sector investment in office blocks and shopping malls, even in IT. There's very little increase in GDP that comes out of all this. What does do it is really essentially what's in the light industrial sector, in the private sector, and this is really where we've fallen down. Because what we've allowed our country to do is become so uncompetitive in the industrial and manufacturing world that the proportion of our national income that comes from manufacturing has fallen and fallen and fallen. Even as late as about 1970, about a third of our GDP came from manufacturing. Now it's less than 10%. And this is what has caused a huge proportion of the problems that Lisa and John have been talking about. Because the problem is that the deindustrialization has led to enormous inequalities in this country. And in three particular dimensions which are really crucial, I think, for the future. The first is regionally. Regionally, the disparities now between London and the rest of the country are incredible. The gross value added, that's the total added value per employee in London, is £44,000 a year. In the northeast, it's about 18,000, and in Wales it's 17,000. It's less than half. And if you look at the job opportunities there are in the different regions of the country, they are massively different. Lisa just described the situation in Wigan. But this is true of vast swathes of the country. What you've got is London, which is romping ahead and getting richer and richer all the time, while the rest of the country is stagnating. And this is one of the problems of deindustrialization, but it's not the only one. It's partly that you've got a regional problem, partly that you've got a productivity problem because the quality of jobs in manufacturing is much higher than it is in services. even now, despite the enormously adverse way in which manufacturing has been treated in this country, wages in manufacturing are about 20% higher than they are in services. It's left the scope for increasing productivity, which is much easier to achieve in manufacturing than it is in services, bereft of opportunities, which is one of the reasons why the growth rate is so low. And it's also left us with a huge national problem of not paying our way in the world, because we have a massive balance of payments problem every year, something like £100 billion, which is sucking resources out of the economy all the time and making it more difficult for the government to support other areas of the country, and again exacerbating all the inequalities. So what are we going to do about all this? Well, I think that it's a crucial issue about how the economy has been run, particularly for the last 40 years, since the sort of Thatcherite era and the time when economic history moved away from Keynesianism to the neoliberalism that we've had for the last 30 or 40 years. And what happened in the late 1970s, when inflation became a real problem, was that everybody lost sight of competitiveness. Interest rates went absolutely sky high to base rates were nearly 17% at the peak of all this, and as it jacked the exchange rate right up and left us very, very uncompetitive for many years. But the situation then became even worse during, actually it was the Labour Party government that did this, which allowed enormous swathes of British industry to be sold to foreign interests, and our football clubs and our chocolate factories. The whole of Britain was up for sale for years in the 2000s. And this jacked the exchange rate up higher and higher. And this left the economy incredibly uncompetitive, not in services where we've done really very well, but in manufacturing where the cost base was far too high. And part of the problem for all this is that the way this country is run is so centralised and so dependent on London and so dependent on the metropolitan elite, who are all tied in with the service sector and with government and not with manufacturing, with the result being that the way the economy is run is very much in their interest rather than the interest of the whole of the rest of the country. And whereas the service sector can live with an exchange rate of maybe $1.50 to the pound, manufacturing needs much, much less than that, probably maybe more or less parity with the dollar. So the real question is, are we going to stick with the kind of neoliberalism that we've got now and rely simply on the service sector to try and get us out of the mess we're in at the moment? Or are we going to have a really radical change in policy to make the economy more competitive, to shift our resources into a different path? Industrial strategy we need on the supply side, you need to change the demand side as well. And I think this is a really crucial question, partly for the Labour Party, but partly for the country as a whole. Because if we don't do something about this, I think, as I said at the very beginning, we're in for another decade of no wage increases for most people at all. And I think that's a terribly destabilising, unhappy and unnecessary future. And I hope we're not going to be there. And I hope we will be prepared to make the radical changes that are necessary to stop that happening.